Thank you for joining me for the Lifeway study of the Minor Prophets. This is session 5, and the title is No Escape. It's Jonah chapter 15 through chapter 2, verse 10. And the lesson summary statement is believers who run from God are unable to escape His discipline. One of the things I enjoy doing with my grandchildren, my small grandchildren, is play hide and seek. Now, I'll just be honest with you, they're terrible at it. They will giggle and laugh and give themselves away. I can even ask, where are you? And they'll say, I'm over here, and that kind of thing. But the thing about hide and seek is the real point of hide and seek is to be found. And when it comes to our decision of a relationship with God, there are times we may be like hiding from God, but what we really want is to be found by God. In some way, every believer plays hide and seek with God. But I've got good news for you. You will be found by God. The lesson summary statement says believers who run from God are unable to escape His discipline. Jonah is an artfully crafted book, and it has just many wonderful details to it. But the basic book can be divided into two parts. There's chapters 1 and 2, and it is a command from God to the prophet, but the prophet fails to obey. Then there's chapters 3 and 4. Again, a command from God comes to the prophet, and this time he does obey. The theme of the book has been discussed, and many things have been mentioned. The subject of missions, that God cares for all people. The subject of racism, or it tells us something about God, that maybe He is bigger hearted than we've ever imagined. And the point of the book is that God refuses to be the God that Jonah wants. He is a bigger God. So there are many themes about the book of Jonah that are profitable for us in studying this book. There are 3 reasons that are given for Jonah being a historical incident instead of a parable. One is miracles. A miracle is the suspending of the natural laws of creation. And God is a miracle working God. He made creation and He can do miracles, and He does miracles. So the miraculous events of the book of Jonah is not a reason to believe that it is anything but a literal story. The second thing is it's written as historical truth. It's written like the book of Genesis, only it has a quicker pace and there are fewer details about it. Of course, the most convincing reason to believe that Jonah was a real prophet and these events literally happened is because Jesus speaks about Jonah and the events of him being in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights as a literal event. He uses it to refer to his literal 3 days and 3 nights, and he wouldn't use a parable in order to do that. So there's a real fish, a real prophet, a real vomiting up on the dry land, and a real nation that turns to God at a very simple message that Jonah preached. Now, one of the things I'm going to do in my lesson is use the beautiful map that they provide for us and show them where Nineveh is at, where Tarshish is at, where he got into the boat, and the direction that Jonah was leaving. And this is one of those occasions where just studying the geography of a Bible text speaks great messages and truths about it. Jonah was trying to get as far away from obeying the call of God as he possibly could. God called him to go east, and Jonah went west. Now, in this lesson, it's about people who are running from God. And what's going to happen in your class is you're going to have people in your class who have people they're concerned about, people they love, and those people are running from God. What is it that you could say to them that would give them comfort, that would give them hope? Well, notice the titles to these lessons. God calms, God hears, God saves. The person who's praying for and is concerned about somebody who's running from God, what do they need? They need to know that God can give them a calm and a peace, They need to know that God hears them when they pray for their prodigal. And they need to know that no matter how far they go from God, God saves. This is a very hopeful lesson for the people in your class who have prodigals they're praying for. A Jonah. There may be people in your class and they've arrived and they are Jonah. They are running from God. Maybe you can't see it, you don't know it, you haven't noticed it, but their heart has turned. And what do those people need to hear? They need to hear that God can calm whatever it is that's troubling their heart. They need to know that God hears them when they pray. And they need to know that God can save them before they ever get into the depths of the storm and the depths of the sea. So what you have in this passage is you have a text that really can minister hope and peace to people who are experiencing the Jonah syndrome. The first point is God calms. Now chapters 1 and 2 covers what happens on the sea. That's verses 1 to 13. And it covers what happens under the sea. That's verse 14 through the end of the chapter and into chapter 2. And so have someone summarize what happened on the sea, verses 1 through 13. And you may want to add some details to the telling of the story of Jonah's leaving and the trouble with the sea and all that the sailors did to try to save Jonah and to save their own life. Our lesson steps in as the sailors are throwing Jonah into the sea. And so let's read those texts and give some explanation as it's important. Then they picked up Jonah and threw him into the sea. And the sea stopped its raging. The men were seized by great fear of the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. The Lord appointed a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. And so in your discussion with the class, it'll give you an opportunity to discuss some of the details about the text. For example, I'm going to ask the class, the point says that God calms. Well, who is it or what is it that was calmed? Well, of course, the sea was calmed, and your commentary gives you some good information about explaining what had happened. The sea literally, it was like a light switch that was flipped. It went from being light to dark or dark to light. The calm suddenly stopped. And that's not what happens with great storms at sea. This week, we've been hearing about and praying for the people of Florida and the Hurricane Ian that has hit land there. And maybe it would be a point to talk about some of the extraordinary things we've been hearing about the power of that storm. I heard one commentator saying he was at a bay that was 100 miles north of where the eye was before the storm, just before the storm hit, and he was talking about the water that was being pulled out of the bay. I mean, what kind of power does it take to pull water out of a bay there on the Gulf side of Florida? You wouldn't expect, you can't anticipate that would just suddenly stop. One man I heard talked about that it was going to take a series of days of the tide coming in and the tide going out for them to restore the natural level of water that had been pushed into the land. I mean, it's just tremendous power at sea. And yet when these men acted in obedience to the word of the prophet, suddenly there was calmness. God can give that kind of calmness. And then the second one, of course, would be the sailors. They had been greatly fearful for their life, and suddenly they are fearful of the Lord. And there are just a number of things here that you could talk about like that. What are the factors that contributed to them being calm? Well, one of the things I want to mention is the fear of the Lord. That's always good to talk about what that means. It is the essence of saving knowledge and wisdom. And when the Bible talks about the fear of the Lord, in essence, what it's talking about, yes, it means reverence and worship and amazement and wonder, all of those things. But in essence, what it's talking about is you take God seriously. Now, a person who takes God seriously, God has an impact on their time. God has an impact on their values, their priorities. God impacts the way they relate to people, the roles that they fulfill in life, their money, the use of their gifts. A person who takes God seriously, God influences and shapes every aspect of their life. That's what happened with these men, these sailors. They had been seeking their gods, but suddenly they saw the God of Jonah and what he can do, and it says they feared the Lord. And you'll notice the word that Jonah uses here is capitalized. It is Yahweh. It is the personal name of God. And it indicates these men came to some kind of personal faith in the living God. They had recognized this was the God of the universe. And a testimony to the reality of their faith is they offered sacrifices, not before. They were doing that to their pagan gods. But afterwards, there was an evidence of their devotion to this God afterwards, and they made vows to him. So there's fear. That leads to their calm when they fear God more than they fear anything else. There's obedience. That leads to people being calm. There is their view of God. He is a great God. He's greater than any other issue they may be facing. There's faith in God instead of in their own efforts. They proved to themselves that they simply could not save themselves. They could not save Jonah. So they came to understand that the saving is in the power of God. In verse 17, it talks about the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow Jonah. The word appointed is found 4 times in the book of Jonah. It's here in chapter 1, verse 17, when it talks about this fish. It's in chapter 4, verse 6, about a plant. It's in chapter 4, verse 7, about a worm. It's in chapter 4, verse 8, about the wind. And each time, God orchestrated a circumstance to teach something to Jonah that he desperately needed to know. Oftentimes, with 20/20 hindsight, we understand the most important lessons in life have been learned as a result of difficult events or times that God used to bring good and to do good in our lives. Well, there is, first of all, God calms. Secondly, God hears. Verses 1 to 4 in chapter 2. Now there's debate over the sincerity of Jonah's expression in this psalm, but it is a prayer, fundamentally a prayer of thanksgiving for deliverance. This prayer can be divided into 2 parts. There is, first of all, a prayer of desperation, chapter 1, verse 6a, and then secondly, there's a prayer of deliverance, verse 6b to 9. So first of all, let's look at verses 1 and 2. Jonah prayed to the Lord, his God, from the belly of the fish. I called to the Lord in my distress, and he answered me. I cried out for help from deep inside Sheol. You heard my voice. He is at the brink of death when he calls. Now, think how encouraging this statement is. God hears. Think how encouraging that is to the believer who is running from God. So first of all, why should God not listen to Jonah? And I would list some of those things. He was being openly disobedient to God. He was being disrespectful of God. He was not honoring God. Just the things that the class could list as to why God should not listen to Jonah. And yet, the very moment that Jonah turns his heart to God and he cries out to God in distress that he caused, God hears his voice, even when he's on the brink of death. So, verse 3 to 4 says, when you threw me into the depths, into the heart of the seas. Now, I thought it was the sailors that threw Jonah into the sea. But he is recognizing that God is doing this work of deliverance for him. He has brought to him this discipline into his life. He said, the current overcame me. All your breakers and your billows swept over me. Even the waves he sees as being a part of God's hand in his discipline. And I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look once more toward your holy temple. He thinks he's beyond God. I'm beyond your sight. The point of it, I'm beyond God. And yet he says, there will come a day when I will see God. I will turn to God. This phrase, once more turn toward your holy temple, is a phrase that we use to speak of a person turning to God. And back at the temple, there was the Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat. And over the mercy seat, there was the blood of the sacrifice that was spread. And because of that, sprinkled, and because of that, you could speak to God. You could be forgiven by God. And so when he says, I'm turning, once more I turn toward the holy temple, he's saying there's a day in which I'm going to be in relationship with God. I can speak with God. God can use difficult circumstances to turn us back to him. If we respond rightly, we will learn to be completely open and dependent on God. Would you give me an example of someone experiencing difficult times? They may or they may not be at fault for the difficulty. But who is someone, can you just give details that without divulging any kind of confidentiality, who's experiencing difficulties? It may be a health issue that someone's going through and the news is not good, or the news doesn't look to be good. Maybe a relationship issue. And just have somebody describe that. Now let's say they choose to stay close to God in that difficulty. They choose a life of repentance. They choose to say, God, you are always right. Now, what's going to be the outcome for that person? And I'd like the class to discuss that. And then I want to talk about the prodigal son. Some have said that the book of Jonah is found in the story of Jesus in the prodigal son. In that parable in Luke 15, the prodigal who leaves is like Jonah who is left here in the first 2 chapters. And then the older son who is legalistic and demanding, he's like Jonah in the last part of the book. So the prodigal son experienced a change of life when he came to recognize that God is always right and that you should choose a life of repentance of wrongdoing. And how was that son's condition different than the other son? The point I'm driving at is God hears us when we cry, and God moves in to bring deliverance to us. The last point is God saves. What he does in these verses of Jonah's deliverance is he takes us back to that experience to see the magnitude of God's salvation. Verse 5, the water engulfed me up to the neck. The watery depths overcame me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. That is a desperate situation. I sank to the foundations of the mountains. He's thinking he's sinking to the bottom of the ocean. There's no rescue there for him. The earth's gates shut behind me forever. There was an understanding in that day about Sheol that it had gates. Jesus referred to the gates of Hades, and those he says my death was certain. The gates of the grave were shut on me. Then you raised my life from the pit. There's the hope. God delivered him from drowning. You delivered my life from the pit, Lord my God. His personal God. As my life was fading away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you, to your holy temple. Now, he had failed to remember the Lord, and the idea of remembrance is, there's a good explanation in the commentary, the smaller book about this idea of remembrance, and here in this leader's guide as well, that it means more than just recalling, it means responding to God. He had failed to remember the Lord. That is, he had failed to respond in obedience. But now he remembers the Lord. He is responding in obedience to the Lord. And and my prayer came to you, to your holy temple. Those who cherish worthless idols abandon their faithful love. Now, he introduces the idea of idolatry to help you see that he has turned away from his works to grace. To put your dependence upon an idol, a chunk of wood or metal, or some other issue that you give worship to is simply a waste of effort. There's no help. And he was saying that he had turned back to the covenant, to worshiping God. Those who cherish worthless idols abandon their faithful love. It's the word hesed that is often translated mercy. It's talking again about the faithfulness of God towards his people. But as for me, I will sacrifice to you with a voice of thanksgiving. I will fulfill what I have vowed. So his devotion, his sacrifice is expressed first of all in a prayer of thanksgiving. And then that is followed up with a vow of obedience. And then he says this great verse that really summarizes the whole Bible. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Now it has the preposition tells us the possession of salvation. Who is the one that provides salvation? Only God provides salvation. How many of you watch a movie at home without the lights on? You watch movies with lights off. Well, why do you do that? I'm interested because I don't do that. I have family that when they come and we watch a movie all together, they'll ask to turn the lights off. And it just never dawns on me to do that. Well, why is it that if you're one of those who likes to watch the movie at home with the lights off, why is that? What Jonah is doing is he's painting this terrible backdrop, this frightening, terrifying scene of his lostness, of the fact that he's near death. And yet, God steps into that and rescues him. The only thing that would be more frightening than drowning in this kind of a fashion would be a cross, wouldn't you say? If you were sinless, you'd never known disobedience of God. You'd never known sin in your mind or in your heart or in your actions or in your words. You'd never known sin. And then you become the bearer of sin on a cross. That has to be most frightening. And we see it in what God's Son was willing to do for us in order to save us. It's a powerful text. And one of the things that I'm going to do with my class to close, I'm going to give them a shoestring. I'm going to ask them to put it in their Bible and just to use it as a reminder that we must stop running from God. That only running from God only leads to discipline. And that God is at any moment ready to give us calm and peace. God is at any moment willing to hear us. And God at any moment is willing to save us. Now, one more thing about the lesson summary statement. Notice, believers who run from God are unable to escape his distance. If a believer is running from God, it must mean he's running to something. What is it he's running to? Whatever it is, it's an idol. And it will not save. It will not rescue. And so, just keep that shoestring in your Bible and let it remind you to ask yourself, am I running from God? Am I running to something else other than running to God? Because believers who run from God need to know they're unable to escape God's discipline. God bless you for teaching his word.